Hello, I am Gamer Vince, and this is my tutorial on Pathfinder and 3.5 D&D combat. What I'm going to be going over today is how sort of the most complicated aspect of the game, which is the combat, how a typical combat will run. I'm not going to be able to cover all the nuances because that's going to depend in largely what your characters do, and there's a lot of options, but I'm hoping that today at least you'll come away with this with the sort of rudimentary understanding of how combat works in Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so what I've got set up here for you is a mock combat between some bad guys, some monsters. We've got like a Slad over here, a Gnoll, a Bugbear, and a Snake, versus our intrepid heroes. We have an Archer, a Drow Wizard, a Thief, Rogue character, and a Warrior up in front. And I'm just going to be going over how these all work. And also for reference down here, I've written down AC, flat-footed, which would be flat-footed AC, and touch AC. So that is something you're going to have to keep in mind throughout the combat, and I'll be going over that when what applies. Okay, so let's just go over a very simple combat. Let's say that these creatures walked up to you and you saw them coming. It's not a surprise round, and maybe you guys were talking. You've already got your weapons drawn because you thought that this was going to result in combat, and then they say like, all right, enough talk, let's fight. If it was a surprise round, this would work slightly differently, but I'll be going over that in a little bit. If this is just a normal combat with no surprise round, everybody rolls a 20-sided die. Everybody rolls a 20-sided die and adds their initiative modifier. That's in it, usually abbreviated on a character sheet. And whoever has the highest gets to go first. Tie is broken in favor of whoever has the higher initiative modifier, or at least, I'm not actually sure if that's a rule, but that is usually how I do it. So if you have a +5 initiative modifier and roll a 4 to get a 9, and somebody else has a +0 initiative modifier, but also rolls a 9, then the person with the +5 would go first because they have the higher modifier. The tie gets broken in their favor. That's usually how I do it, and I think it's a pretty good way to do it. It's not going to happen that often. All right, so let's say that they all rolled initiative, so now we know in which order they're going to. A shortcut for DMs is quite often to roll initiative for all the monsters together so that they move together and that you only have the players roll individually. That's usually recommended for DMs if you've got like groups of enemies. If I had like 4 bugbears and like 3 gnolls over here, I'm going to roll for those 2 groups independently. And just 1 roll for all of them. Alright, once you've determined what order you're going to go in, whoever's turn it is going to get 3 actions. And those 3 actions are a standard action, a move action, and a swift action, as well as sort of any assortment of free actions that you could have. Free actions are, as they say, they are free, but the DM can put a limit on some of those if need be. For instance, talking is a free action up to a certain number of word sentences. You're not going to be able to, give a hour-long monologue in your turn. A turn is supposed to last 6 seconds. That is within game terms. You don't need to take 6 seconds to take your turn, but 6 seconds is what is supposed to be one entire round of combat, and it's all supposed to be happening relatively simultaneous. But in any case, during your turn, you get to do a move, a standard, and a swift. So what can you do with those? A move action is the simplest. That usually you're going to use to move. So let's say that we have our fighter buddy here. He can move up to 4 squares because he's slowed down by his heavy armor. So he's going to move up to 4 squares, and he's going to go 1, 2 to get here to this archer over here, and it's just going to hit him. Then he's going to use his standard action to make an attack, and the attack is almost always going to involve a 20-sided die. There are very few attacks that don't. Magic Missile is the only one I can think of. If you are attacking with a melee weapon, which he is with his hammer there, if you're attacking with a melee weapon, you roll the 20-sided die, add your melee attack modifier, which would be your strength modifier, plus your base attack bonus, plus any kind of miscellaneous bonuses like, say, a magic weapon or weapon focus or something like that. You would add those two things and then compare it to this Knoll's AC. If it is not a surprise round, then it is just versus armor class. And if you equal or exceed the armor class, like if the armor class is 18 and you rolled an 18, you hit, and then you roll damage. And damage for a melee character is going to be some weapon die, like a d10. Some weapons, like you're just going to have to look up the weapon. So if it's like a rapier, then it's going to be a d6. If it's going to be like a long sword, it's going to be a d8, and so on. You're just going to have to look it up for the weapon. And you get to add your strength modifier in damage for melee weapons. If you are using a melee weapon in two hands, like if you're gripping like a great axe or a great sword or something along those lines, where you're using both hands, you get to add your strength modifier plus half your strength modifier again. So it's like 1.5 of your strength modifier. So that's how a melee combatant would work. And then you would deal damage, and then damage would be dealt to the character, reduced from their HP, and then you would move on to the next player's round usually. Our fighter still has a swift action left, but most fighters don't really have a way to use them. Sometimes it's going to be a couple of different things. Okay. All right, so that is basically what a fighter is going to do, probably like, maybe 8-9 times out of 10. Usually move and attack. But let's talk about a couple of other things you could do as a fighter. So our fighter was here. He could also do what's called a charge. A charge is you get to use your move and standard action together. So you consume both your move and standard, and you can move up to twice your speed and get an attack. So the caveat with that is that you have to move at least 2 squares. So he'd get to move 2 squares like normal and then get an attack. That is useful for the charge action is useful for 2 reasons. One is that when you charge, you get +2 to your attack. So you're sort of like bearing down on your opponent, just running at them headlong and smacking them right in the face. So you get +2 to attack. It does leave you vulnerable to counterattack because you're sort of opening yourself up. So you get a -2 to AC until the beginning of your next turn. So +2 attack, -2 AC. If you need the attack, charge is a good thing to do. The other reason why it's good is that, so normally, like I said, you have 1 move, 1 standard. If the guy was all the way over here, I would do a move action to, say, get 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I would have to take another action, 1, 2, 3, to get all the way up to him. I'm not sure if you can see that. That might be slightly off the screen there. But if I have to double move to get there, then you don't have a standard action left to attack. By the way, if I didn't make, I'm not sure if I mentioned that, but standard actions can be used as move actions. So you can downgrade standard to move to double move. That is a thing you are allowed to do. Or take, if you have things that only take move actions, like casting certain spells, you could cast 2 move action spells during a round. Alright, so charge would allow you to double move and then still attack. And that is one of the best uses of charge, is to double move and attack. But like I said, the caveat is that you have to move at least 2 squares to your target. So if he's here, I can't charge. You have to go straight to your target, which means that there has to be an unobstructed line between you and your target. So I drew like a tree here, and this is difficult terrain in case you were wondering what this is. So if he was on this side of the tree, I wouldn't be able to charge because I can't do a straight line. I would have to get around the tree. Okay, so charge is a very useful thing for fighters to do. Another thing that fighters might do is do what's called a combat maneuver, like a trip attempt or disarming your opponent, like taking their weapon. And you're going to have to, number one, I do not recommend using combat maneuvers unless you've taken some feats or have some ways of making them better. Because the first thing that happens is that if you do like a trip attempt or a disarm attempt without having a feat in it, you're going to provoke an attack of opportunity, which isn't good. And second of all, your chances of success aren't very good. But I really like what they did in Pathfinder, which is that they added a combat maneuver bonus and a combat maneuver defense. and that's exactly what it's for. If you're trying to disarm your opponent, or if you're trying to trip your opponent, you would roll a 20-sided die, add your combat maneuver bonus, and then compare that to your opponent's combat maneuver defense. That's CMB, combat maneuver bonus, and CMD, combat maneuver defense. So they've really streamlined that in Pathfinder. In 3.5, you're going to have to calculate it out yourself, but I believe the calculation is the same. So yeah, combat maneuvers is something you can do, but don't try them without feats. Is what I'm recommending here. But that's something that fighters can do, and if you want to do that, trip is a pretty decent one to have, or get a weapon that can trip or something like that. All right, so that's the fighter's turn. He's just going to go up here and attack. So very simple. All right, let's say that it is the rogue's turn, because this helps us set up something else. So let's say that our fighter knew that the rogue was going to help out, and that the fighter went to, say, over here. So the fighter went all the way around here, didn't get an attack or anything like that, but did move into what we call a flanking position. Actually, I'm going to move this guy back a little bit, just so I don't confuse viewers. All right, so now let's say it's the rogue's turn. The rogue is going to move up to here and is going to attack this guy right here. Now you might be wondering, well, how is this different from the fighter example? And it's different in two ways. So first of all, when you are on exact opposites of a unit, like with somebody wielding a melee weapon, or threatening is what it's called. So this fighter is definitely threatening this archer, because the fighter's got like a melee weapon in his hand. If you are threatening it and you've got two guys on opposite sides, they're considered flanking. And what flanking means is that basically you just get a +2 to attack. So this rogue would get a +2 to attack. The fighter would not have gotten a +2 in his attack because nobody was there yet, but on the rogue's turn, now they are flanking. And this is also important for rogues, because rogues get sneak attack when they are flanking, or when their opponent is somehow denied their dexterity bonus. So this is the simpler of the two scenarios, which is flanking, gets +2 to attack and gets a sneak attack, which is explained in the rogue ability, but it's basically an extra couple of d6s of damage. So if I'd hit, I'd do, like an extra 7 damage or something like that. You get an extra couple of d6s of damage. And yeah, that's sort of what the rogue does. Sneak attack is usually what the rogue is going to do. The other scenario when the rogue would get a sneak attack against an enemy is if that enemy is flat-footed. So I think this is a good time to talk about AC, flat-footed AC, and touch AC. Armor class is, the basic AC is sort of your combination of not only being able to sort of deflect blows, but also being able to dodge them. So that's how you can think of these. There's two ways to not be hurt by an attack. It's either to be really heavily armored, and it doesn't matter that the attack hits, it doesn't go through your armor, and the other way is to dodge it entirely. So those are sort of the two ways that you cannot be hurt by an attack. And AC represents your ability to do all that. Your armor class is both your ability to dodge and just absorb hits. Flat-footed AC is when you are unable to dodge. So flat-footed means that, like, you can imagine, like, if you're dodging, you're going to be sort of on the tips of your, not necessarily on the tips of your toes, but like on the balls of your feet. And when you're flat-footed, your feet are firmly on the ground. You're not going to be able to dodge, really. You're not going to be able to move around. And that's what flat-footed means, is that you're denied your dexterity bonus and any other things like dodge bonus and things like that to your AC. A lot of character sheets sort of calculate this for you. If you are calculating it, flat-footed AC should be the same as your regular armor class, but without dexterity and without dodge. Those two things are not part of flat-footed AC. And that's what flat-footed means. When are you flat-footed? You are flat-footed when either you can't see your attacker. So like if this rogue here was invisible. If this rogue was invisible, and it doesn't matter if you're flanking or not, but if this rogue was invisible and just snuck up to this guy, and that guy, the archer, had no idea the rogue was there, then this archer would be considered flat-footed for the rogue's attack, for the rogue's first attack. So that's one way to get it. The other way is during a surprise round if you haven't acted yet. If there's a surprise round, as in you didn't know combat was coming, like things jumped out of a bush or something like that, it doesn't matter if you were surprised or weren't surprised. You are flat-footed until you act. Until you get a turn in combat, you are flat-footed during a surprise round. So, yeah. So if this was a surprise round and the heroes surprised these guys, and this guy was totally surprised, he didn't know this was going to happen, then he is flat-footed until he gets an action, until his initiative. Okay, good. So that's flat-footed AC. Touch AC is when you can dodge, but you can't absorb a blow. So touch AC would be like, for instance, say your opponent is trying to cast a lightning bolt through his hands. Like the wizard is trying to touch you with a lightning bolt in his hand, like Shocking Grasp. That's what the spell is called, Shocking Grasp. He's trying to touch you, and you're in armor in full plate mail. The plate mail isn't really going to help you absorb or not take damage from the lightning, now is it? In fact, it's a bunch of metal that's going to help you get hit, not prevent it. Touch AC is sort of when is it irrelevant that you wear armor, and that's exactly what touch AC is. It is equal to your armor class, but without I'm not sure if it includes deflection bonuses. Actually, I don't think it does, and without your armor. So like your fighter is going to have a pretty high flat-footed AC because he's not relying on dodging, but he's going to have a pretty abysmal touch AC, while the rogue is the exact opposite, who's going to have a very high flat-footed AC, a very high touch AC and a very low flat-footed AC because they're reliant on dodging, high dexterity and all that. So yeah, touch AC only comes up usually when a spell or when an attack says to use touch AC. So flat-footed AC can come up much more often because it sort of comes up naturally. It's like, hey, I couldn't see you. I'm surprised in this combat. Then they're flat-footed. But if they're but touch AC, on the other hand, it doesn't come up unless sort of a spell or something says to use touch AC. So touch AC I think is the simpler of the two because you're always going to be told when to use it. Default is armor class. If it doesn't say and there's no reason they should be flat-footed, armor class is the way to go. Okay, so that's the rogue's turn. Pretty good. Now let's say that we've got our wizard friend here who wants to do something. The wizard is going to start casting a spell. Spells can range in length from one full round action, a standard action, move action, even a swift action to cast some spells. So they can be of all types, all shapes and sizes. So let's say that this wizard is going to cast a 1 round spell. That's not a full round action, it is a 1 round spell. So if a spell takes a round to cast, that means that he's going to start casting it, and the spell isn't going to go off until the beginning of his next turn. It's not going to affect his next turn, but he's just going to stand there casting, sitting there like a lemon, until the beginning of his next round, which is important if he gets attacked. Okay, and in fact, let's do that right now, just to let you know. Let's say it was the bugbear's turn, and the bugbear is going to charge the wizard and attack him. Now, the wizard is casting a spell, and the wizard is about to take damage. Ouch. And what that means is that now the wizard has to make a concentration check. A concentration check is going to be his caster level plus his casting modifier. So if he's a wizard, that's his intelligence modifier. So if you're a wizard, you're going to add, if you're a 5th level wizard with a +5 intelligence, you're going to have a concentration check of 10. And you add to that things like feats. Like if something says +4 to concentration check, like combat casting, you would add that to that. So let's say he has all that, so he has a +14. So combat casting of +4, intelligence modifier of +5, and a +5 caster level, and that's going to be his concentration check, his ability to concentrate on his spell. So he's going to hit him, which is going to require a concentration check. He's got to make that concentration check or lose the spell. If you fail the concentration check, you lose the spell. If you make the concentration check, you're fine. You still took the damage, that all still went through, but you don't lose the spell. If you were to lose the spell, well, that's just too bad. He expends the spell slot and doesn't get any benefit from it. So being a caster kind of sucks at times. But let's say that he made the concentration check and he's going to keep casting. All right, so that's very simple. All right, let's talk about ranged characters for a minute. So this Gnoll over here is kind of in bad shape. He's completely surrounded by enemies. And he's got a ranged weapon. So if you've got a melee weapon, you're not really going to do... there are these things called attacks of opportunity. Attacks of opportunity is basically whenever you give an opponent that is within melee range of you an opportunity to just give them an opening, and they get a free attack on you. Every character gets one attack of opportunity before their beginning of their next round. That's important. So for instance, if this archer here was trying to just run circles around this fighter, the fighter would only get one attack of opportunity instead of a couple of attacks of opportunity. There is an exception to that, of course, which is combat reflexes gives you more attacks of opportunity. So if you're looking for that, that's a good feat to have. Though it's based off your dexterity bonus, keep that in mind. All right, so let's talk about attacks of opportunity. Let's say this archer here needs to get out of here, because using a ranged weapon like a bow, short bow, crossbow provokes an attack of opportunity if done next to melee characters like these two guys here. So he doesn't want to shoot his bow because that would allow 2 free attacks by these guys. And by the way, attacks of opportunity have to be a basic attack. That means a regular strength plus base attack bonus attack. It can't be anything fancy like a combat maneuver or a spell. It can't be any of that. It's just a basic attack. You're just quickly jabbing them with your sword or whatever you have on hand. So he might say well, I don't particularly want to fire my ranged weapon. Now he's got a couple of options. The first one of which is probably his best option, is what's called a 5-foot step. A 5-foot step is considered, the way you can think of it is like a free step. Like you're doing something else, like say defending yourself, or you're firing your bow or whatever, and you can take a 5-foot step. And a 5-foot step, a way a 5-foot step works is that you just literally go one square in any direction. So this Gnoll might just step right outside here and get out of range of these two guys. If you take a 5-foot step, you cannot use a move action to move. What that means is that a 5-foot step doesn't cost any action. It's just a natural part of other actions. Like the way you can think of it is like leaning into a swing. Or just moving about while casting a spell. You can kind of in a given 6 seconds, you can kind of shuffle your feet and get to places without a full-on sprint. So that's the way to think of it sort of thematically. But in combat, what it means is that you basically get a free step that does not provoke attacks of opportunity. But you cannot move afterwards. You can't take a 5-foot step and then keep running as a move action. No, you cannot use a move action to move. Or standard action move. You can't move if you took a 5-foot step. So what he might do is he might step here and then shoot his targets freely. Another option he could do is he could try to draw a melee weapon. So if he's got a sword on his hip, he can try to draw that sword, so that he would be melee defended, against all those melee opponents. Drawing a weapon is a move action. And actually, now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure that that drawing a weapon also provokes an attack of opportunity, so that may be not his best course of action. He might think to himself, well, I'm going to 5-foot step, I'm going to drop my bow, and I'm going to draw my sword. He might do that. Or he might put away a bow. Putting away a weapon is a move action, and drawing a weapon is also a move action. So he could put his bow on his back and draw his sword and take a 5-foot step, and that would all be legitimate. So now he's a melee armed Gnoll. Or he can do the thing where he 5-foot steps and shoots. The other thing he could do is just fire his bow and just take the attacks of opportunity. I mean, that's always an option. It's maybe not ideal, but hey, maybe you've got reasons for doing so. Okay, So that is attacks of opportunity. Attacks of opportunity are provoked, by the way, most commonly when an enemy leaves a threatened square. So let's quickly talk about threatened square. If you have a melee weapon and are a medium-sized creature, more often than not, your threatening range is going to be all the squares around you. There are weapons that have the reach quality, in which case it would be all the squares 1 square away from you, but not the squares next to you. So, watch out for that. Threaten, and you provoke an attack of opportunity when you leave a threatened square, and that's important. So, for instance, like if this bugbear here is threatening all these squares, and the thief decides to move into one, that's fine. It's not moving into a threatened square that provokes an attack of opportunity. It's moving out of it. And that can, use that as your guidance. So if this thief, for instance, decides to step into here, into the threatened square, no attack of opportunity yet, but then decides to keep going, now he's left this threatened square here and provokes an attack of opportunity. Okay, cool. So that's all pretty simple. Let's talk, another thing that provokes an attack of opportunity is casting a spell within range of an enemy. Though there you have an additional option. You can just, of course, get out of the way if you can with a 5-foot step. But you can also do what's called casting defensively, where you need to make another concentration check, which I believe the concentration check you have to beat is a 15 plus double the spell level. And if you can, and by the way, concentration checks you always add a d20. But if you can beat that, then you cast the spell normally and do not provoke attacks of opportunity. If you fail that, I'm pretty sure you provoke an attack of opportunity. And then, of course, you're going to have to roll, and if you take damage, you may lose this spell altogether. So just be aware of that, spellcasters. Okay, so one more thing I want to mention is creatures, large-sized creatures. That's why I've got the slat on here. And for attacks of opportunities, that large-sized creatures tend to have reach, which means that they usually they have reach that just goes beyond like a normal reach weapon. A reach weapon, you'll get if this bugbear was wielding a reach weapon, he wouldn't be able to attack these squares right around him because he's got a reach weapon. His opponent's got to be at a distance. Monsters quite often have reach where they can attack both squares next to them. So both, so the rogue here would be within this guy's threatened reach because he's 2 squares away from him, and the fighter would not be. But if he took a 5-foot step, then now both of them are within reach of this slad here. So keep that in mind, that large creatures tend to have a threatened area proportional to their size. So the bigger the creature is, so if it takes up, say, a 3x3 square, then it's probably going to have three squares of reach. So keep that in mind. Though DMs, watch out for that. It will say within the monster manual what their reach is. Like if you're looking at a monster stats, it will tell you what the reach is. Okay, so that's attacks of opportunity. That's all that. Let's talk a little bit about quickly about terrain. You notice that I put a bunch of dots here. What I'm doing here is I'm representing this as difficult terrain. In order to go through difficult terrain, it takes 2 points of movement to get into a difficult terrain, which means that it's difficult to move around. What that means is that if you could move 6 squares, you could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 squares of movement gets you just half as far in difficult terrain. And there are no 5-foot steps in difficult terrain. So that's what difficult terrain is. I occasionally like using it. A couple of other things that might happen to you during combat is, say you try to drop prone. Dropping prone, by the way, is a free action. You can at any time well, not at any time. At any time during your turn, you can just drop to the ground. And dropping to the ground does basically 2 things. One, melee attacks have +4 to hit you. So if a bugbear is next to you stomping you in the face, well, he's going to get +4 to hit you. So that's no good. But ranged attacks, so if this gnoll here was trying to shoot this guy, ranged attacks have a -4. You're a smaller target on the ground, you're harder to hit. So that's what dropping prone does. It is a move action to stand back up. So keep that in mind. Dropping prone is a good way if there's lots of enemy archers, but it is kind of bad when there's somebody next to you. Standing up also provokes an attack of opportunity, so if you've dropped prone and a guy is standing next to you, then standing up is going to provoke an attack of opportunity. I'm also pretty certain, no, you cannot take a 5-foot step while prone. It's not a step anymore, it'd be a crawl, and that's no good. So dropping prone can be very dangerous. Yeah, and that's also why the combat maneuver trip is pretty handy. Okay, and I think that about covers it for sort of a regular combat. I may mention a couple of other things in sort of a nuanced tutorial. One other thing I do want to mention is surprise rounds, because they can happen quite often. During a surprise round, what would happen first is that as the surprise happens, every character that would be surprised gets a perception roll, which is, in Pathfinder, a perception roll is a perception roll. You add a d20 and add your perception skill. In D&D 3.5, it will be a spot or listen check, maybe even both, and they have to try to beat their opponent's stealth. And if they get a high enough, then they're not surprised. And they get to act in the surprise round with them. During a surprise round, you only get a single standard action. You do not get a standard move and swift. You get one standard action. However, there is I will mention right now that there is a special charge action you can take during a surprise round, which is called a partial charge. So that's a pro tip right there. A partial charge allows a character to move up to their speed and make an attack, and they can only do that if they only have a standard action. So, you know, the fighter here who has surprised this wizard could do a partial charge to get there, and you notice that it moves you half the distance of a charge, but you still get to move and attack. And the same -2 to AC, +2 to attack applies. Okay, and I think one more thing that I should mention is what's called a full attack action for higher level play. Once you get multiple attacks in a round, say either because your base attack bonus is very high or because you took feats, in order to get the benefit of those additional attacks, you have to do what's called a full attack action. This is pretty much true across the board. If you have additional attacks, you must take a full attack action in order to gain the benefit of those attacks. And a full attack action takes up your standard and your move. So that means if this bugbear here could attack multiple times, he would have to start the round next to his opponent in order to get the benefit of those attacks. So if this archer kind of runs away, then the bugbear could do a charge or could move and attack, but he won't get his multiple attacks. Don't forget, though, that a 5-foot step is always a possibility. You can still 5-foot step in full attack action. Okay, I think that about covers most of the basics of the combat system. I know it seems like a lot, but the system is actually not that complicated. You get used to it. One thing that's maybe a little bit complicated is when to know when to use these, when to make a concentration check if you're a wizard, and a little bit like that. But if you get the basics down of you get a standard move and swift, roll a d20 to attack, that kind of thing. Once you got that, you got most of it. So I hope this tutorial has been helpful, and I'll see you guys next time for some more D&D and Pathfinder stuff. Thanks for watching.